What's up guys, it's Aaronitmar, and today we are going to be talking about the most popular Square Enix franchise in history. No, we're not talking about Final Fantasy, and there's no way we're talking about this trash. We're talking about generic anime swordsman rage emoji, wait. Oh, sorry, that was my Twitter feed. Today we're talking about Dragon Quest. In an iconic reveal during E3 2019, a trailer for the second Fighter Pass character revealed that not only would the Luminary from Dragon Quest XI be available as a fighter in Smash, but he was bringing with him the protagonist from Dragon Quest III, IV, and VIII as well. All four of these characters comprise a single character slot called Hero. Hero's reveal saw a very polarizing reaction from the community. While Dragon Quest fans were happy, many unfamiliar with the series thought that this was a waste of a slot or that Dragon Quest wasn't relevant enough, and those people could honestly not be more wrong. It may look like just another JRPG, but Dragon Quest is basically the father of the JRPG, with many of the creative mechanics invented specifically for the series still surviving in games to this very day. But let's go back, before all of this, to the very first Dragon Quest game, and we'll see how this huge franchise got its humble beginnings. In 1975, the Eidansha Boshu Service Center published tabloids that advertised real estate. After a few years, the business wasn't successful, and it was restructured into a gaming software company called Enix. The founder of Enix ran a number of programming contests with a 1 million yen prize in an attempt to find potential games for the company to release. The first contest winner was a man named Yuji Horii, an editor for Shonen Jump who created Love Match Tennis, which went on to become Enix's very first published game. In a second contest, second place went to Koichi Nakamura, a high school student who created Door Door, a puzzle game which would go on to be Enix's first release for the NES. Both of these games would go on to sell reasonably well, and Enix approached both of the programmers to ask if they could create more. Yuji Horii proposed an adventure game which would eventually release as the Portopia Serial Murder Case. It combined two of his passions into one single experience: the storytelling of manga with the engagement and interactivity of video games. Enix liked the idea, and Horii spent the next few years developing Portopia and two further games in his adventure genre. Meanwhile, Nakamura finished high school and had plans to move to Tokyo for college with the dream to make a software company like Namco. While at university, he researched Japanese law on how to formally start a company, and in 1984, he and 6 of his friends registered Chunsoft Company Limited. And while all of this was happening, Nintendo released the Famicom. With the wild success of this console, Enix was looking to publish games for the new market and eventually contacted Chunsoft to begin work on ports of Enix's existing PC games. The first game to be ported was Door Door, and after the successful release, Enix was looking for a brand new opportunity for a Famicom game, and Yuji Horii had an idea. Games like Wizardry and Ultima had taken Japan by storm. These games were inspired by Dungeons & Dragons and were the first attempt at digital versions of this style of game. Horii approached Enix and expressed his interest in developing an RPG similar to those games for the NES. While the idea wasn't outright rejected, Enix thought that the project would probably be too ambitious and suggested something else: a Famicom port of none other than his Portopia game. So, Horii and Chunsoft connected and began working on porting the visual novel to the brand new console. This game was effectively the groundwork for what would become Dragon Quest. Portopia being on the PC gave the player far more control over the game than the Famicom would allow. The PC version of the game thrived on text-based entry, which is something that would be very taxing on a Famicom and would not really be easy for the player at all. In order to adjust for the more limited controls, the game implemented a command and menu system, something that would be crucial in Dragon Quest gameplay. The offices of Enix also had a couple of surprises around this time. Included in all of their games were surveys that could be mailed into Enix offering feedback on their games, and apparently 80s Japanese customers were actually helpful with these, unlike 10-year-old me who probably would have just written poop over and over again. But one name stood out in all of these responses: Koichi Sugiyama, a famous composer with 20 years of film composition experience under his belt. Enix reached out and asked if he would be interested in developing music for their video games, and Sugiyama agreed, which officially began his working relationship with Enix and the video game industry. But it would still be a few years until he put his iconic touch on the Dragon Quest series. Horii's ties as an employee at Jump offered a direct line between the manga publisher and Enix, which leads to the editor of Jump telling Yuji Horii that none other than Akira Toriyama was interested in illustrating for a video game. You may have heard of Toriyama, his little manga Dragon Ball, it was gaining popularity at the time. And in case you were wondering, that is why everyone calls this guy Goku, because he looks like him, and he was made by the exact same dude in the exact same art style. With Portopia completed and a pair of all-stars joining them, Horii and Chunsoft could finally begin development on their dream RPG game. They settled on combining the best aspects of RPGs into one game, the top-down perspective of Ultima combined with the first-person battles in Wizardry. They were also very wary about their decisions based on the new audience. The Famicom was reaching a much wider audience than PC games had ever done, and with Super Mario Bros. Recently coming out and that game's popularity and accessibility, it meant that they had a whole new audience that they needed to cater to. While core RPG fans would be fine with a very complex game, the wider number of brand new customers meant that they needed to make it easy to pick up and play. And again, hardware was an issue, as they had very little memory to work with on the very first Famicom carts. So the ideal scenario for them of having a party of multiple characters needed to be shelved for the time being, and they focused on just a sole player character. This character was important because they were who the player would be. Like in Wizardry or Dungeons & Dragons, you weren't playing for the character, you became the character. They wanted to take that concept and put it into their game. A big part of the development is that the world was immersive and welcoming. This is why the tone of the world was important, as well as having non-player characters. Characters will actually speak directly to the player's character, rather than some all-knowing magical narrator explaining what is happening. The game follows the story of the player as they discover that the princess is being held captive by a dragon. The player's character is determined to save the princess and discovers a tablet with a message from the ancient hero Erdrick, giving instructions on how the player must defeat the Dragon Lord. The player saves the princess, but still must defeat the Dragon Lord. He's given the option to either join the Dragon Lord, which causes the player to fall asleep and the game to freeze, or to fight him in one final showdown. The king offers the hero his kingdom as a reward, but the hero declines, and with the princess, they go off in search of a new land. Dragon Quest I was completed and it was shipped off to Enix, who handled the actual production and shipping of the game's cartridges. This took a few months in itself, during which Chunsoft had already begun work on Dragon Quest II. This strategy ended up working out very well. Dragon Quest I sold decently, but promotion for the sequel later on really increased interest in the first, and they saw a boom of sales after Dragon Quest II was announced. The sequel also had the benefit of increased memory in the Famicom cartridges, which allowed for bigger worlds, more dialogue, and finally a party of multiple characters. Dragon Quest II sold even better than Dragon Quest I, and the game's release cemented it as a cultural phenomenon for Japan. Recently, the Dragon Quest XI director confirmed that while the government never quite intervened, the police complained to Enix developers that release dates for Dragon Quest games on weekdays made them crazy busy. For Dragon Quest III's release day, almost 300 arrests were made for students skipping school because they wanted to wait in line to purchase the game. So from that point on, Enix personally made the decision to launch on Saturdays to help things run as smoothly as possible. That's just how big a deal Dragon Quest was in Japan. Things were different in America though. By the time Dragon Quest I was going to be localized in America, it had the advantage of having better hardware to enable better graphics and have an actual save file system. But the localization had several flaws that put off consumers. The first was a change in the name. From Dragon Quest, they made it Dragon Warrior. This was done to prevent a copyright conflict with a tabletop game of the exact same name, Dragon Quest. Additionally, the game's text was changed into an Elizabethan English style, with a lot of these and thous and thys, which was a severe change from the very self-aware and playful dialogue in the Japanese version. Secondly, the art style for promotional art was completely changed. Rather than the iconic Toriyama style, the art was redone in a way that was meant to appeal more to the Western style, while also trying to emulate the poses and scenes from the original. Despite the coverage in gaming magazines and comparing it to the likes of Zelda, the game just didn't sell as well as they expected, to the point that Nintendo was giving away surplus copies of the game in issues of Nintendo Power. Hearing that they could potentially save a bunch of money on a new game, Nintendo Power saw over 500,000 new subscribers during this time. Despite the first 4 Dragon Quest games receiving good reviews, the series wouldn't see true financial success until Dragon Quest VIII nearly 16 years later. And speaking of games 3 and 4, each respective protagonist from these games are represented as one one of the heroes in Smash. Dragon Quest III: The Seeds of Salvation follows Erdrick, the ancestor of the protagonist from Dragon Quest I and II. He's given the title of Erdrick at the end of the game, and is considered the very first character chronologically to receive this title. So while other heroes in the franchise have received that title, Erdrick usually refers to this specific character from Dragon Quest III. Dragon Quest IV: Chapters of the Chosen features a protagonist named Solo, and together with Erdrick, he represents the NES era of Dragon Quest and Smash. While the first 3 Dragon Quest games are related, being extended sequels or prequels within the same timeline, Solo's story isn't directly related to the first 3, instead being a new story and the start of a brand new trilogy. Both 3 and 4 saw remakes on different consoles, with 3 being released on the Super Nintendo, Game Boy Color, and mobile devices, and Dragon Quest IV seeing PlayStation and Nintendo DS remakes. The next hero comes from Dragon Quest VIII: Journey of the Cursed King, originally released for the PS2 with the 3DS remake in 2015. His default name in the manual is 8, which is coincidentally the same number of seconds it took them to come up with that name in the first place. Dragon Quest VIII is the first Dragon Quest game released after the merger between Square and Enix, all previous games simply being Enix releases. It was also the very first game to adopt the Dragon Quest title outside of Japan, because up until the 7th installment, the games were still being titled Dragon Warrior. The owner of the Dragon Quest tabletop RPG, Wizards of the Coast, did not renew the trademark, and in 2003, Square Enix registered their use of Dragon Quest in the United States, finally abandoning the Dragon Warrior title entirely. And lastly, the final and default hero is the Luminary from Dragon Quest XI: Echoes of an Elusive Age, released for PS4 and 3DS. The Luminary is the default hero for Smash not only because he's the most recent protagonist, but also because of Square Enix's close work with Nintendo in bringing Dragon Quest XI's Echoes of an Elusive Age Definitive Edition to the Switch. This version of the game is the absolute definitive version, as the name suggests, and it combines the best parts of the 3DS and PS4 versions into one single game while also adding additional content. And there are a bunch of other Dragon Quest games. I mean, we've only got 4 heroes in Smash, but there are 11 games total, and you can see in the final Smash there's just a ton of protagonists, not to mention party members, non-playable characters, and things like that. This series is pushing 40 years, and it is just such an influential franchise in the grand scheme of things that it honestly is surprising that it took this long for it to come to Smash. And that is the story of Dragon Quest, a few rising stars combining with the power of a legendary composer and an iconic anime artist to create the first game that would go on to be one of the most popular gaming franchises and the grandfather of an entire genre of video games. Now, other companies would take Dragon Quest formula and apply their own twist to it. Square had Final Fantasy in production, and Pokemon was right around the corner. But you could argue that without Dragon Quest, these games may not even exist today, and I think that is just incredible. But seriously, Hero can kill you at 0. I mean, what the...